Hi, it's week 2 of the official campaign launch for my book in kinship. There's something super profound to me about the fact that the way this book is being brought into reality is through community. I woke up this morning and found that we had arrived to the halfway point of my €10,000 goal, and I don't think there are words to express what this means to me as a person, as a writer, as a creative, as a general yearner and carer. So if you're watching this and you've contributed in any way, whether it's responding to comments, whether it's sharing my GoFundMe or sharing my content, I feel like you're here with me, and I'm incredibly inspired and motivated by the proof of concept and the idea that I'm believed in. I wanted to do something to commemorate the milestone of this, and in typical Jamila fashion, I imagine it will be a bit unconventional, but I wanted to start to share some of the foundational themes and concepts of the book. These things have surfaced for me over the course of a significant amount of research and a general wayfinding process, if you will, in terms of what this book is about and who it's for. So about 3 weeks into researching and writing in kinship, I realized that I had made a terrible mistake. Writing about relationships is really difficult. One of the first things that I have learned about relationships, whether it's reading Dr. Stan or other neurobiological researchers around the theme of kin and care and love, is that relationships don't exist. So I've put myself in a position to write about things that do not technically in our material world exist. Relationships are things that we create, right? We build them and we assign and take meaning from them that is co-constructed, but it is conceptual. It is not physical. It seems like this is something that should be obvious, but as I began to explore some of the texts and the language of relationships, it surfaced a paradox for me in terms of how we talk about relationships versus how we understand them to be. And let me explain what I mean here. So when we use words to describe relationships, our linguistics are very clear on that. We talk about relationships being between two people, right? As if the thing itself, the noun of a relationship, like existing between two or more people, right? However, when we talk about how we interact in relationships, it seems like we have a much clearer line or direction towards another person, right? I'm talking to you. I'm trying to get you to understand. I'm trying to make you listen. So it's a very funny thing to run up against in the initial phases of trying to essentially come up with definitions. And so in my process, what I've realized, and again, this will be unconventional because I'm going to conduct, in I guess some ways, a self-conducted artist interview. Instead of being able to jump to the definition of relationship, the definition of kinship, I've started to think more about where relationship is located, because that seems to be something that, using our language and our sort of cultural norms, it's easier for us to understand. And so as I'm trying to locate relationship, this is where I started, and this is some of the foundational work that I think will guide the rest of the book and how I am coming to understand kinship and the process of reclaiming it and using it to our advantage. So I started with this very rudimentary illustration, which I think indicates one of the big myths we have as far as relationships go, being in relation to others, right? We see you, or in this case, ourselves, and another person or others in general. And we seem to think that when we're talking, when we're conflicting, when we're trying to get our needs met, that we are interfacing directly with the other person, right? That we are going words to brain and connecting directly. You know, I imagine it kind of like if you're in an office building and there's this incredibly sort of arduous process to get to a CEO. We think that when we're talking with each other, when we're relating with each other, that we are skipping past that receptionist desk, heading straight to the top floor to the CEO's office and having a chat. Something that I've learned over the course of this study is that that is not the case. What it more looks like, according to the research and according to the ways that relationships are designed cross-culturally, is that there's you and there's another person, and there's a space where things occur. And so what's happening when we think we're relating to each other is we're both interacting with things in the space where things occur. And so this was a very important point for me to arrive to, right? Is when we're thinking about relationships traditionally, we're thinking about our behavior, our expectations, our wants and needs, the things that we like, that we don't like, that we're neutral about generally, and how to get another person to understand that and essentially do the things that we want them to do so we can feel the things that we want to feel. When we start thinking about this as the operational space of relationship, right? This is really the relationship between two people, two parties, a mother and a child, whatever the case may be. We're able to understand on a much more, I think, action-oriented level why sometimes we fall into unloving, why sometimes relationships become fraught and conflictual. Because let's say, right, that what I have offered here in the space where things occur is a big smile and a high five, right? For me, in the space where things occur, this should be seen very obviously as a sign of goodwill, as an offering of friendship, whatever the case may be. Now, if this person witnesses that smile and a high five over here, and they have a shared life experience that connects with that, they have a shared context for that behavior, then great, we're on the same team. We're high-fiving, we're smiling, we are rocking, we are creating relationship. Imagine The Sims +1+1. Now imagine if they don't. Imagine if this is a person that doesn't know me very well, doesn't have a lot of context around this, maybe was bullied as a kid, experienced a lot of sarcasm in their upbringing. They may experience what I have placed here in the space between us as a threat, as sarcasm, or as an insult. And so this is really interesting and important because it gives us three spaces to work with relationally. And this is going to be sort of laid out in the beginning of the book to sort of align on definitions. Because as I said before, I'm learning that relationships are incredibly difficult to describe. Honestly, I'm thinking, why did I decide to write a book about something that is essentially liminal, existing in liminal spaces? But I digress. What happens here, right, is this gives us some really interesting stuff to play with. We've got three dynamics to play with. We've got the self, we've got the other, and we've got the space where things occur. So the first thing that surfaced for me in the research and the understanding of conflict, of relationality in general, is that there's two things that need to be triaged at any given time. And triage isn't necessarily detecting for threat. In some of my other videos, I've talked about the concept of emotional triage, right? How do we understand where another person is enough to respond to them effectively, or understand where we are enough to respond to ourselves effectively? So we need to check in on how we're doing. For example, if this person, us, you, us together, is hungry, is tired, had a bad day, is stressed, has too much on their plate, etc., they are going to have a very different experience with this space where things occur. And the same goes for the other person. And so when we're able to check in with ourselves and also triage the other person effectively, we have a better shot at putting things into the space where things occur and getting a response that feels relational, that operates and offers a sense of nourishment. Another thing is that when we are talking about the space where things occur, when we are effectively able to triage ourselves and others, we're able to threat detect first and foremost for ourselves. One of the things that I'm learning the most about how relationships are created and why there are certain relationships that are so formative and why some relationships are so formative and terrible for us and so formative and wonderful for us has to do with agreements and what we commit to doing, how we commit to showing up. And so if we can get really good at understanding the emotional triage state of self, the emotional triage state of another, then we can make sure that what we're putting in here is very well aligned, right, to what the other person would need to feel connected, a sense of belonging, safe, etc. If we don't do a good job of that, right, if we don't develop an expertise in the other person, if we don't self-triage, check for our tones, if we're not effectively protecting another person or a group from ourselves in a non-triage state, we have another issue. So this is one of the first things that's come up for me. And because I tend to be illustrative when I'm working out complex ideas, I was looking a bit at this illustration that I made. I was like, well, what would happen if we put like little legs on that square, the space where things occur? Well, then this starts to look a little bit more like a table, right? It looks like a table, a place where things are sort of being offered back and forth. And I think in the most exalted state of relationship, and I'm just drawing a curly little tablecloth on this for the benefit of you all, if we could actually turn this space into what is essentially an altar, then we're in business. And the reason for that is because the themes that have shown up in terms of how our formative relationships really jack us up, the way that we end up kind of seeking relationships that mirror or replicate some of those ways of being really jacked up, is because in the same way that we didn't necessarily become an expert in ourselves through self-abandonment and estrangement, right? This can look like drugs, this can look like alcohol, this can look like overworking, overstressing, taking on a caretaker role, resentment. This can look like a lot of things. We've self-abandoned in some way. We don't have a great idea of what it looks like to be presented something in the space where things occur that actually leads to us feeling well, safe, cared for, belonged to enough, right? When we have gotten so used to either over-speaking and self-protecting, hyper-vigilance kind of thing, or we have become people pleasers who are need devoid, we don't have an idea of what needs to occupy the space where things occur that would feel good for us. And then on the other side, even if a person is earnestly trying to get us there, we may not be able to receive it, and vice versa. Another really interesting thing about this, right, is that the idea that people, it should seem obvious, but it's not, aren't monolithic. And so we get caught up in these sort of social scripts that are supposed to dictate what is normative in this space where things occur, right? So if we go back to that high five analogy that I used before, right? You could argue that this is the Western world and that everybody knows what a high five and a smile is, and therefore someone should not be upset. So something that happens is that we have social norms, things also like white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, Westernism, the concept of polite in general, that restrict how creative we're able to be in the space where things occur, and actually cause us to feel threatened at the idea of being innovative or at the idea of breaking script in this space. And so when it comes to relationships, right, obviously, like I said before, people are not monolithic. This limits our options in terms of what we're willing to do, as in how we're willing to show up, what we're willing to offer somebody in that place, and also what we're willing to receive. What do we think can happen there? What do we think relationships can feel like, right? And so if you think about this as people passing things back and forth on this table, putting something on the table, seeing how this person responds to it, putting something on the table, seeing how this person responds to it. It is in our interest to have the most abundantly curated set of things possible to place in the space where things occur. I know this sounds strange and complicated. I really hope that this is enjoyable for you as I'm sort of working through these concepts and mapping them out, I think in a more concise and legible way for the book. But to continue, right? So when we don't feel like we have a diverse and highly curated set of things to put here, we fail and our relationships fail. And it's very weird to me because the simplest way to get a diverse and highly curated, right? It's not diverse and random, it's diverse and highly curated set of options in the space where things occur is first and foremost to look at the people around you, whether it's your children, right, your spouses, your friends, your colleagues, whatever the case may be, and become an expert in the other person. This is the curation piece. So when you treat the other person like you are an investigative journalist, where you learn not just their story, but their story as it relates to getting the best out of them, you begin to curate, you begin to understand in deep and sort of vertically learned ways what works and doesn't work for that person, right? When you don't experience getting it wrong as rejection, et cetera, all the things that are really, really difficult to do, frankly. But to get to the sort of initial point, you develop some curation. When you do the belief system deconstruction needed to work with some of the shame and the guilt, right? When we start dealing with our internalized misogyny, dealing with the way that we've internalized white supremacist, imperialistic, capitalist systems, systems that demand that we perform to a level of perfectionism, that we hoard resource, even if that resource is affection, right? When we start to do systems deconstruction around that, then we also find that there's a lot more things we're willing to give, willing to offer from a place of generosity, and a lot more things that we're willing to receive. And so this is kind of at the crux of understanding the location of relationships in our lives, where the relationship is happening, where it's playing out between us or a group or an individual, and then what is in the way right now. And so when I'm kind of in this generative space around it, it's been quite interesting to see the lack of things that I expected. So I really expected that there would be more about love, more about romance, more about general affection and attachment. But what I found through my research is that a lot of what we're doing when we're in relationship is tuning our nervous systems to the other person and figuring out how we need to behave to keep ourselves safe and what we need the other person to do to keep us safe. And this is really interesting because when it comes to how relationships are built, it's not very effective. Something Dr. Stan talks about often, as well as Dr. David Ariely in his book, Probably Improbable, I believe it's called, is that humans are consistently irrational. In the same way there's no objectivity in conflict because of what's happening when we have this amygdalic hijack moment. We're incredibly ill-equipped to deal with the relational stressors. And so what we're tuning our nervous system to is essentially an objectified form of another person. So we make another person and their behavior is very big, and we make ourselves very small. And so what happens when we do this is that we're not using anything related to our prefrontal cortex to make this relationship work. And so it's a very fascinating process to see skills instead of love or affection or passion, or these kind of deep emotions that all sort of surface to mind when we talk about relationships. The thing that I'm seeing the most come up in terms of relationships that work well are things like negotiation, seduction, and agreements. Something Dr. Stan also says all the time is that the only ways that humans have come together to really create anything that wasn't chaos amongst each other was deciding what we always do and what we never do and working from there, right? There needs to be a system of governance. There needs to be a sense of a higher purpose in relationship. What are we here together for? Why do we believe that the person, the friend, whoever it is the best deal around, so much so that we are willing to be told, do that or stop that? And so this is sort of an initial introduction into some of the foundational theories that I'm working on, that I'm really excited about. And I hope that as I continue to explore this topic over the next months, as I'm building out this manuscript, I'm able to take you all sort of more along this journey. I'm now going to transition into a pretty bizarre section of this, if you don't mind, where I'm just going to sort of spitball some questions for myself about the process of writing and the things that I'm finding interesting. And I'm just going to interview myself in a very literal way. Hi, Jamila. It's so great to have you here. It's amazing to see the progress that you've made, not only on the campaign, but on the book. Thank you so much. I'm beyond excited. You have no idea. I think this is one of the moments in my life where I was experiencing so much chaos with my health, with the suggestion that I be evaluated for multiple sclerosis, with transitioning from one country to another, and relationship stuff of my own going on. So there's something quite interesting in that I always wanted to be a writer ever since I was little. And now, almost in this very high stakes clutch moment, it feels like it's really happening and really possible for the first time in my life. That is just so incredible, Jamila. It's amazing to have you here. Just sort of on the surface, what has it been like to start to write a book for the first time? Has it been scary? Has it been really natural, fluid for you? It's a good question. I think my process with the writing has actually been to meet myself where I'm at. I have learned about myself in this process that I am a preparation procrastinator. And so what that means for me is that I am listening to a lot of podcasts and reading a lot of books about relationships. And for a while, even before I announced the book, I was doing a lot more prep on how to write a book than I was putting pen to paper. Now I'm realizing that with where my health is and the symptoms of my health, which often affect my eyesight and things like that, I found a process that really works, which is actually working from where I'm speaking. So I am trying to spend a good amount of time kind of talking about the different components, structural components of the book as if I'm teaching someone, and then taking that transcription and using that as the foundation to write from. And this process has really made it so much more helpful. I think I don't know that I would be able to sit down formally at a computer and stare at a screen, for 6 hours a day. And I also don't know with where, oftentimes I have some mobility issues in my hands, etc., that I would be able to write with a pencil as quickly as my mind is moving around some of these topics. So I'm glad that there's a lot of technology support. I'm glad I'm doing it in a time like this. But it's really hard. It's really hard. Yeah, I think starting new things in general is incredibly hard. So it's amazing to hear you speak so transparently about your process. Thank you. I am so grateful you said that, because there is a small part of me that wants to pretend that I just took to it like a duck in water, but that's just not the case. Well, that's good. And we're happy to hear from you no matter what. So when you think about your long-term strategy with the book, you're talking about some of these foundational themes, elements. What do you expect that final product to look like? It's another terrifying question. Thank you for asking me. I think for the final product of the book, I'm more focused on how the content is structured right now than turning it into a behemoth. It's a very simple concept that I want to lay out, and anybody who's watching this who has worked with me will know that I have a tendency to add on and I have a tendency to get inspired really quickly. And so the basics of the book are really this, right? There are ways that we abandon ourselves, and then that abandonment turns into abandonment in our interpersonal relationships, which turns into our abandonment of our communities, which turns into our abandonment and abdication of responsibility to larger issues, whether it's Palestine, the Congo, racial issues, gender issues, whatever the case may be, but it feeds a sense of sort of internalized helplessness. And that abandonment of self, of community, also ends up creating estrangement. And that estrangement damages our ability to reactivate those axes, those levers of belonging that we're really looking for, to reclaim, which is the fundamental thesis of the book, kinship. When we self-abandon, when we abandon our relationships and partnerships, when we abandon our community, and we begin to operationalize estrangement, we begin to take on the behaviors, the maladaptive traits of estrangement as norms for how we are and how we are supposed to be and how our families are supposed to work and how our friendships are supposed to work and what we can feasibly ask from people, because we are operating in a sort of fully onboarding operating system that only knows to be estranged, right? Estranged from our own needs, or holding at a distance the willingness we're willing to invest in other relationships, etc. And so then the concept of being asked of very much antagonizes this operational estrangement, and I think creates a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today, whether it's around, political extremism or just an incredible epidemic of loneliness. And so to reclaim kinship, I think, is to confront a lot of these things, a lot of the ways that we abandon self and are encouraged to, the way estrangement is cultivated and put into practice, and frankly, the very real threats and risks of kinship in the world that we live in. Like, there's a reason people are afraid to connect to each other, right? There's a reason. It's almost beautiful and horrific by design that in order to co-regulate, in order to have our systems, our internal systems work the way that they're supposed to, we need systems of interreliance, we need co-regulation, and the things that have traumatized the majority of us the most in life are other humans, are other people. And so there's a lot of work and understanding of the very real dangers of kin and belonging and the risks and the vulnerabilities, and also a sort of a toolkit, if you will, on how to at least start to feel comfortable working towards that and seeing a value in that after there's so much very, very real fear and pain associated with it. That was a long answer, I'm sorry. Well, I sound like a crazy person for interviewing myself, but I wanted to offer a little bit of my process with you all. This is my first time doing something like this, so of course, if you have notes, if you have thoughts, I would love to hear them. And one of the most marvelous things that's come out of this, sorry, the interview's closed. One of the most marvelous things that's really come out of this is not just the support and the insights from people in my community around the book and the material support, and people asking for investments in terms of long-term support as well. Like, people have offered me support in terms of writing workshops, clinics, ongoing support with something like Patreon, all of which I think will be stuff that I'm going to be thinking about down the line. But really just feeling like there's a resounding yes, that it's the right time to talk about these topics and that people are interested and ready and excited to hear about them. So if you're hearing this, if you're reading this, however you're arriving to this, I want you to know that I'm really glad that you're here, and I can't wait to show you more of what I've been working on, and I hope you like it. That's all. Bye.